this conversation, what we did basically was try to understand also from other people who are not here today, who did not participate in the video, about their museum practices and habits in Cameroon. We wanted to know how many people have visited a museum before. And we also wanted to know the age range of the participants, and here you can see the demographics. And I think this is very important when you're analyzing the data to know who and what age group visits the museum more. We also wanted to know how often people visit museums. And on average, how many hours do you spend? A good number of people would spend just 1 to 2 hours in the museum, others less than 1 hour. But this is just to show you that for today's event, we really wanted our conversation to be evidence-based for you to understand the museum habits of the participants and for us to also have this conversation guided by some statistics.
The first objects of a collection, most of them were gifts to Estienne. 2 of his sons were passionate art collectors. The good thing about what we have here is everything we own in our collection was purchased legally.
From our naming ceremonies, our funerals, it could be even from, we could say, initiations, coronations. All these, they take place within a particular space that define who we are in terms of our cultures, in terms of our practices, in terms of our different ethnic groups. So once we identify with this, they also help us to identify with a particular culture. And when you are looking at the relationship between these cultural practices and the museums, we see that, the two, they work hand in glove, although they all have their different functions, because when you visit the museums, you discover that part of our culture is stored in the museum in terms of artifacts, in terms of designs, in terms of other materials that you could find in the museums that also help to shape the lives of most of our activities. But then the challenge we have is that, we realize that when you move to the museums, you discover that they are somehow limited to the kind of information that they would disseminate. Because one, I would say probably for political reasons. And again, when those who are in the museums are not able to give out a clear information that concerns the particular people, you discover that a lot of people will be misled, and even the owners of that history or of that culture, they will feel offended because what they are receiving is not actually what they practice. Then when you go back to the traditional cultural spaces, we realize that these are spaces that help in the preservation of these cultures. They are the only people that have that unique, I could say the unique opportunity to actually tell us who they are through most of these their cultural practices, because it serves as a way of identifying them.
I come from a tribe, Ogu, where we have traditional practices that are probably restricted from some areas or from some set of people like women. And in the cultural spaces, the practitioners at times do not want them to be exhibited in museums. Our cultural spaces were not, one cannot say they were not insufficient before we're taking them to museums. Logically, when we have cultural spaces that talks about our traditions, our cultures, our customs, there is a necessity, like Africans, to create museums so that they can be represented in those museums.
You don't necessarily need to be in a museum to understand or get to know about someone's culture. And at this festival, Mbanga, I got to learn a lot about the people of the Mbam, especially the Bafian man. You could trace their origins back to the northern parts of the country, and they were cousins to the Banso and the Tika people. That's something which I learned being present at a festival. And being at the Ngondo, for example, you would learn things about the culture of the Sawa people without necessarily being in a museum.
My question goes to Dr. Wu. She talks about misinformation in museums, and she cited cases in Europe. I just want to find out if in Cameroon we don't have this issue of misinformation in museums. And if we do, how do you as a professor and other people go about it in order to correct what is known so that the public will not be misinformed?
A lot of our youths do not even know what museums are. Many have not even taken the initiative to visit, just like we saw from the video. And I would also say that it is the place of our higher institutions to try to find a way of bringing these museum studies into part of the curriculum so that our children grow from tender ages knowing what museums are. And by so doing, they will not be disconnected from these narratives that you might get when you enter certain museums. What are we doing about misinformation in the museums? Like I am trying to say now, it has to do with what? Creating that awareness right from base. When you are growing up and you know that these places exist and you try to visit them.
We have documents about the history of our country. And this is one of the things which is particular about our museum. It's not just art objects. In our museum, you have a copy of the very first stamp introduced to Cameroon by the Germans.
Probably when I started carving, still exists. Why? Because we use some traditional methods of conservation, either preventive or curative. There are also some traditional methods, like bury. At times when we carve objects, we bury them. We tie them on leaves and we bury for quite some time, and then we remove them. By that, they must have observed some chemicals naturally from the ground, and there will be no chance for any destruction. Away from that, we equally use some traditional materials, like the wild garlic X. So we must not only rely on those modern chemicals to do our training or to conserve our heritage.
The question I ask myself is, what are we doing with what we have? There's thousands of things, yes, in the Western museums and so forth, but there's a lot here, that we can put. The thing doesn't have to be long-saw, it doesn't have to be this to make the museum something special. The wonderful question, do we need museums? It was a very hard question because in Africa, it's hard because what is Africa, and what is a museum, which museum is it? It was hard. So I said no. if you build a museum here now, what it takes to get a museum going, what it takes to curate and all these wonderful technical things and to keep it going and to fund it and all of that, and how many people, from Oku are going to come here to Yaoundé to go see something. It seems to me that there is a book famine in our country, right? This is something that we have to agree. I mean, there are very few countries in the world where there is not a single public library in the nation. It's impossible to exaggerate what a disaster it is, right? Can we invent some museums that are in a book, right? I mean, you cannot replace seeing an artifact, right, and touching the beads and looking at the mask or something like that. But if we can communicate in writing, electronically, with images and so forth, this can arrive everybody. Probably it can go further, So I'm thinking that perhaps there is something to be said for the book family.